This is the story of the last ruler of an ancient dynasty, a woman who stood at the edge of two worlds, one fading, one rising. A figure both respected and maligned, remembered not only for who she was, but for the empire she tried to protect. This is the story of Cleopatra VII Philopator, the final pharaoh of Egypt. Her reign did not mark the beginning of something new, but the end of something old. She ruled a kingdom in decline, held together by diplomacy, intelligence, and political risk. Our story begins in the city of Alexandria in the final century before the Common Era. Cleopatra VII was born in 69 BCE in the city of Alexandria, the capital of Egypt. She was a daughter of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a royal house of Greek origin that had ruled Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great. The Ptolemies had been installed in Egypt by one of Alexander's generals, Ptolemy I Soter, nearly 300 years earlier. From the very beginning, the dynasty was foreign to the land it ruled. Its rulers spoke Greek, practiced Greek customs, and considered themselves part of the Hellenistic world. They did not intermarry with Egyptians. They did not adopt Egyptian as their primary language. And although they took on Egyptian religious titles and appeared in pharaonic iconography, their cultural center was always Greek. This separation from native Egyptian society was not accidental, it was policy. The Ptolemaic court preserved its power through insularity, most notably through sibling marriage, a practice inherited from Egyptian royal tradition but used here to maintain dynastic purity rather than cultural integration. Brothers married sisters, cousins married cousins. This led to constant instability. Disputes over succession were routine. Family members turned against each other, sometimes violently, to gain the throne. By the time Cleopatra was born, the dynasty had already begun to fray. Internal strife, corruption, and civil war had weakened the royal house. But the external threat was even more significant. Rome. During the 2nd century BCE, the Roman Republic had grown from a regional power in Italy into a Mediterranean empire. One by one, the old Hellenistic kingdoms, Macedon, Pergamon, and eventually Syria, fell under Roman influence or direct control. Egypt remained nominally independent, but that independence was increasingly a matter of appearances. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, nicknamed Auletes or the flute player, was a deeply unpopular ruler. He spent lavishly on his own pleasures while relying heavily on Roman support to secure his position. At one point, he was even expelled from Egypt by a revolt and had to pay a fortune in bribes to Roman senators to regain his throne. In exchange, Egypt's autonomy eroded further. The country itself remained wealthy. The annual flooding of the Nile still made Egypt one of the most fertile regions in the ancient world. Its grain fed much of the Mediterranean. It exported papyrus, glass, gold, and perfumes. But politically, Egypt was no longer a power in its own right. It was a client state in all but name. Decisions of state could not be made without Roman approval. Diplomacy meant appeasement. This was the world into which Cleopatra was born, a world where kings reigned but did not truly rule, a world where legitimacy came not from divine right but from Roman backing. Her childhood was shaped by the instability of her father's reign and the encroaching shadow of Roman politics. She would have grown up surrounded by courtiers, scholars, and spies. The palace at Alexandria was a place of grandeur, but also of suspicion. Every alliance was temporary. Every favor had a cost. In this environment, Cleopatra was educated not only in language and literature, but in survival. She was trained in rhetoric, philosophy, and the art of persuasion. She learned to speak not only Greek, but also Egyptian, Latin, and several other regional languages, an accomplishment unmatched by her ancestors. Even as a child, she would have understood that being a Ptolemaic princess was not a guarantee of safety or stability. It was a position that demanded vigilance, adaptability, and skill. Cleopatra was not born into a golden age. She was born into a declining kingdom, propped up by foreign powers and constantly under threat from within. She would be called queen, but only if she could seize the throne, hold it, and defend it. This was her inheritance, a legacy of wealth without security, power without certainty, a kingdom on the edge of empire. And it would be up to her to decide what to do with it. Chapter 2. In 51 BCE, Cleopatra VII ascended to the throne of Egypt. She was 18 years old. Her accession followed the death of her father, Ptolemy XII, who in his final years had arranged for Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII to rule jointly. He was just 10 at the time. As with earlier dynastic arrangements, the two were also nominally married, a political formality designed to preserve royal authority within the family. But from the start, Cleopatra acted independently. She was not content to be a figurehead. She assumed real power. In official documents, her name appeared before her brother's. On minted coins, it was her face, not his, that appeared. She was presented not merely as a co-ruler, but as sovereign. This was a bold position to take, and it quickly earned her enemies. In the royal court, power did not lie solely with the monarchs. A web of advisors, generals, and family factions shaped policy behind the scenes. Many of these figures saw Cleopatra's assertiveness as a threat to their influence and to the traditional structures of the dynasty. By 48 BCE, Cleopatra's position had become untenable. Her brother's advisors, led by a powerful eunuch named Parthenas and the general Achillas, forced her from power. She was expelled from Alexandria and fled east, crossing into Roman Syria with a small entourage. There she began raising an army of mercenaries and preparing for a return to Egypt by force. At the same time, events outside of Egypt were escalating. The Roman Republic was in the midst of civil war. Julius Caesar, victorious in Gaul and increasingly powerful, was in open conflict with Pompey the Great, once his ally and now his rival. The struggle between them would determine the future of Rome, and by extension, the fate of many client states like Egypt. Pompey fled to Egypt after his defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus, hoping to find sanctuary with the Ptolemaic court. After all, he had once supported Cleopatra's father and still retained influence in the eastern Mediterranean. But instead of welcoming him, the advisors of Ptolemy XIII made a calculation. Believing that Caesar would soon be the undisputed ruler of Rome, they arranged for Pompey to be murdered upon landing. He was lured ashore and stabbed in front of his wife and children. His head was then severed and preserved in a jar as a gift for Caesar. It was a miscalculation. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria shortly after, he was not pleased. Far from being grateful, he was disgusted. Pompey had been his enemy, but he had also been a Roman consul, a member of the ruling elite. His assassination by a foreign court was viewed as an affront to Roman dignity. Caesar chose to remain in Alexandria. Publicly, he cited the need to stabilize Egypt and resolve the dynastic dispute between Cleopatra and her brother. In reality, he saw an opportunity to install a favorable regime and extend Roman influence more directly. Cleopatra understood this. She recognized the arrival of Caesar as a turning point, and she moved quickly to capitalize on it. She arranged a secret meeting with Caesar inside the royal palace, which was under the control of her brother's forces. Later, Roman writers would tell a colorful story of how she was smuggled into Caesar's chambers, wrapped in a carpet or a bundle of linen. While the details may be embellished, the essential fact is clear. Cleopatra made contact with Caesar at a critical moment and secured his support. With one move, she turned her exile into an alliance. Chapter 3. Cleopatra's meeting with Julius Caesar marked a critical turning point in her struggle for the throne. While the accuracy is debated, its symbolism remains. It portrays a ruler willing to take calculated risks and a politician who understood the power of spectacle. What matters more than how she entered is what followed. The meeting secured Caesar's backing. As dictator of Rome, his word carried enormous weight. With his support, Cleopatra's position was transformed from that of a fugitive claimant to that of Rome's preferred monarch. But support alone did not resolve the situation. The Ptolemaic court was fractured. Ptolemy XIII, still just a teenager, refused to yield, and his advisors saw Caesar's involvement as a threat to their own survival. The palace and the city quickly descended into open conflict. What followed became known as the Alexandrian War. Over the course of several months, Caesar's small force, initially unprepared for extended siege, was pinned down inside the palace compound. Supplies dwindled, fires spread through parts of the city. Notably, some ancient accounts suggest that portions of the great library of Alexandria were damaged or destroyed during the fighting, though the full extent remains uncertain. Reinforcements eventually arrived from Roman-controlled Syria. With them, Caesar was able to break the stalemate. In the final phase of the conflict, Ptolemy XIII attempted to flee across the Nile, but drowned in the process. His body was later recovered from the river. With her rival gone, Cleopatra was reinstated as queen. As required by dynastic tradition, she now ruled alongside another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. He was only around 12 years old at the time. In theory, he was her co-ruler. In practice, power rested solely with Cleopatra. It was during this period that Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy XV, but he was publicly referred to as Caesarion, Little Caesar. Cleopatra stated that Julius Caesar was the boy's father, and it is likely that he was. While Caesar never officially named Caesarion as his heir or made a formal acknowledgement, he did allow the child to bear his name and did not dispute Cleopatra's claim. For Cleopatra, the birth of Caesarion was more than personal. It was political. In a world where dynasties were maintained through bloodlines, having a son connected to Rome's most powerful man was a strategic asset. It strengthened her legitimacy and potentially gave Egypt a bridge to influence in Roman affairs. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra traveled to Rome, accompanied by Caesarion and a retinue of courtiers. She took up residence in one of Caesar's villas, located just outside the city. Her presence was not a secret, nor was it welcomed by all. Among the Roman elite, her arrival caused discomfort and resentment. Caesar was already married to a Roman woman, Calpurnia, and Cleopatra, a foreign queen claiming to bear his son, threatened both decorum and political order. Despite the unease, Caesar remained openly supportive. He had a statue of Cleopatra erected in the temple of Venus Genetrix, linking her image to the divine lineage of his family. It was a public signal that she was not simply a guest, but a person of status and favor. Yet the atmosphere in Rome was tense. Caesar's rapid accumulation of power, his centralization of authority, and his disregard for traditional republican norms had earned him many enemies. On the Ides of March 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated in the Roman Senate. He was stabbed 23 times by a group of senators who believed they were saving the republic from tyranny. The political landscape was instantly thrown into chaos. Cleopatra, realizing the danger of being caught in a fractured and unpredictable Rome, made the decision to leave. She returned to Egypt, accompanied by her young son. With Caesar gone, her position was once again uncertain. She was no longer the consort of Rome's most powerful man. Her protector was dead. Her child's paternity no longer served as a direct bridge to power. The world had shifted, and once again, Cleopatra would have to adapt. Chapter 4. The assassination of Caesar in 44 BCE created a power vacuum at the heart of the Roman Republic. It did not restore the Republic as the conspirators had hoped. Instead, it plunged Rome into another round of civil conflict. The question was no longer about who would govern Rome, but who would dominate it. Two men quickly rose to prominence. One was Mark Antony, a seasoned general and loyal supporter of Caesar, and the other was Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew and adopted son, known to history as Octavian. Though young and initially underestimated, Octavian would prove politically astute and unrelentingly ambitious. The two formed an uneasy alliance, along with Marcus Lepidus, in what became known as the Second Triumvirate, a legally recognized three-man dictatorship charged with restoring order to the Republic. But the alliance was temporary. Personal rivalries, competing ambitions, and diverging interests would eventually tear it apart. In the east, Mark Antony was tasked with consolidating Rome's authority over its provinces and securing funds and troops for future campaigns. Egypt, with its enormous wealth and strategic position, was essential to that effort. In 41 BCE, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus, a city in what is now southern Turkey. Officially, he wanted to question her about Egypt's loyalty and financial support during the preceding wars. Unofficially, this was a test, not only of Cleopatra's allegiance, but of her political weight. Cleopatra did not arrive passively. She staged her entry with purpose. Sailing up the Cydnus River, she appeared on a barge outfitted in gold and purple, styled as the goddess Isis. Her attendants were dressed as cupids, and she herself was adorned in fine silks and jewelry. It was a theatrical statement of sovereignty, wealth, and divine association. The gesture worked. Antony, who admired Greek culture and was known for his appreciation of spectacle, was impressed. But more than impressed, he was intrigued. Cleopatra offered more than symbolism. She brought economic power, diplomatic experience, and control over the grain supply that Rome relied on. What began as a political exchange evolved quickly into a personal relationship. Cleopatra returned to Egypt after the meeting, but Antony soon followed. By 40 BCE, they were living together in Alexandria. Their alliance deepened, and so did their family ties. Over the next several years, Cleopatra bore Antony 3 children, twins named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later a third son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Their union was not simply romantic, it was strategic. Together, Cleopatra and Antony reshaped the eastern Mediterranean political landscape. Antony distributed Roman client territories to Cleopatra and her children, expanding Egypt's influence well beyond its traditional borders. In a public ceremony held in 34 BCE, known as the Donations of Alexandria, he declared Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, to be the legitimate heir of Caesar's legacy and co-ruler of Egypt. The children of Cleopatra and Antony were granted titles and lands across Armenia, Phoenicia, Syria, and even parts of North Africa. It was a bold move and a dangerous one. To the Roman public, these actions were unacceptable. Antony, a Roman citizen and consul, appeared to be giving away Roman territories to a foreign queen and her offspring. Octavian seized on this perception. He portrayed Antony as a man corrupted, no longer Roman in royalty, but subservient to an Eastern monarch. In speeches, Octavian accused Cleopatra of manipulating Roman affairs for Egyptian gain. He painted her not as a sovereign ally, but as a foreign threat to Roman values. Antony, he argued, had become her instrument. The traditional Roman fear of monarchy and of Eastern decadence was weaponized for political ends. By 32 BCE, tensions could no longer be contained. The Roman Senate, under Octavian's influence, declared war, but not on Antony. The declaration was made against Cleopatra. It was not just a war of politics, but of perception. Antony had tied his fate to Cleopatra's. In doing so, he had given Octavian the narrative he needed. Rome would now fight not a civil war, but a foreign war. Chapter 5. The final confrontation came at Actium, a narrow strait off the western coast of Greece, where the Ionian Sea meets the Ambracian Gulf. It was a strategic location, selected not only for its geography but also for its symbolic weight, a place where the future of the Mediterranean world would be decided. On one side stood Octavian, commanding a disciplined and unified force. His admiral, Marcus Agrippa was one of the most capable naval commanders in Roman history. On the other side were Mark Antony and Cleopatra, backed by a large but divided coalition of Eastern allies, including Egyptian and Levantine forces. Their fleet was formidable in size. Some estimates place it at over 200 ships, but cohesion and morale were already deteriorating. The weeks leading up to the battle were defined by attrition. Agrippa launched a series of calculated strikes along the coastline, severing Antony's supply lines and capturing key positions. Antony's forces, cut off and worn down, remained anchored in the Gulf, hoping to outlast the blockade. Disease, hunger, and desertion began to take their toll. On September 2, 31 BCE, the fleets finally engaged. The details of what happened that day remain partially obscured by time and propaganda, but the general shape of events is clear. The Battle of Actium was primarily a naval engagement, fought with old warships known as galleys. Cleopatra commanded a reserve fleet of Egyptian vessels stationed at the rear. She had brought 60 ships to the confrontation, many heavily equipped and well manned. As the battle intensified, something unexpected happened. Cleopatra's fleet began to retreat. Her ships broke from formation and sailed towards the open sea. Why this happened remains debated among historians. Some believe it was a pre-planned escape, coordinated with Antony. Others see it as a sudden retreat born of panic. Still others suggest it was a calculated move, an attempt to preserve Egypt's naval assets in the face of likely defeat. Whatever the motive, Antony followed. Leaving the bulk of his fleet behind, he broke away and pursued Cleopatra's retreating vessels. This decision sealed his fate and the fate of the war. Without their commanders, the remaining ships were left leaderless. Confusion turned to collapse. Many surrendered. Others were destroyed or burned by Agrippa's forces. It was not the bloodiest battle in Roman history, but it was decisive. The war was effectively over. In the aftermath, Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria, hoping to regroup and rebuild, but their power was broken. In the months that followed, Octavian advanced steadily through the eastern provinces. One by one, local rulers either surrendered or switched allegiance. Antony's supporters vanished. His armies disbanded. His allies defected. By the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian reached Egypt. Inside Alexandria, the mood was grim. Supplies were exhausted. Troop morale had collapsed. Antony attempted one last show of strength, launching a limited cavalry attack outside the city. It failed. Recognizing that resistance was no longer possible and unwilling to be paraded as a prisoner in a Roman triumph, Antony took his own life. According to most accounts, he fell on his sword after receiving false reports of Cleopatra's death. He was taken to her, mortally wounded but not yet dead. He died in her presence. Cleopatra's fate remained uncertain. Octavian had entered the city but had not yet decided what to do with her. She attempted negotiation. She may have hoped to preserve some measure of autonomy for her children or for Egypt itself, but she knew what a Roman victory meant. She had seen it before. And so, in August of 30 BCE, Cleopatra took her own life. The exact method remains a subject of speculation. Classical sources describe the bite of an asp, a venomous snake smuggled into her chambers. Others suggest she used poison concealed in a hairpin or ointment. Whatever the method, the message was clear. She would die a queen, not a captive. With her death, the last chapter of the Ptolemaic dynasty closed. Egypt, once an empire of pharaohs, became a Roman province. Octavian returned to Rome not just as a victor, but as the unchallenged ruler of the Mediterranean world. Chapter 6. When Cleopatra died, she was 39 years old. Her reign had lasted 21 years. The exact details of her death remain uncertain. Classical sources, chiefly Roman historians such as Plutarch and Cassius Dio, report that she ended her life using an asp, a venomous Egyptian snake smuggled into her quarters in a basket of figs. Other accounts suggest that she applied a topical poison to her skin or used a hidden vial concealed in a hairpin. Some suggest she may have even tested various poisons on prisoners before to determine the most effective and least painful method. What is agreed upon is that her death was deliberate, pre-planned, and symbolic. It is not an act of despair. It was a political statement, one last exercise of sovereignty. Cleopatra chose death over humiliation. She refused to be taken to Rome as a prisoner of war, displayed in chains in a Roman triumph, paraded as a trophy before a cheering crowd. She had seen it before. Decades earlier, she had been in Rome when Vercingetorix, the defeated Gallic chieftain, was marched through the streets before being strangled in a dungeon. Cleopatra understood Roman rituals of conquest. She would not be part of one. Her death left one critical question unresolved: the fate of her children. Her eldest son, Ptolemy XV Philopator Caesar, better known as Caesarion or Little Caesar, was just 17 years old at the time. He had been declared co-ruler during her reign and publicly presented as the biological son of Julius Caesar. Cleopatra had long hoped to position him as Caesar's true heir, a bridge between Egypt and Rome. But Octavian, now the undisputed ruler of the Roman world, could not allow Caesarion to live. His existence represented a direct threat to Octavian's authority and legitimacy. As Caesar's adopted son, Octavian had built his claim to power around being Caesar's sole successor. A rival, especially one with blood ties to Caesar, could not be tolerated. Shortly after Cleopatra's death, Caesarion was captured. On Octavian's orders, he was executed. The method is unrecorded. His death marked the final elimination of any independent Egyptian claim to rule. The fate of Cleopatra's other children, those fathered by Mark Antony, was different. The twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, along with their younger brother, Ptolemy Philadelphus, were spared. They were taken to Rome, where they were placed in the care of Octavia, Mark Antony's former wife and Octavian's sister. Octavia, known for her dignity and restraint, raised them in her household. Little is known about the fates of the boys. Historical records concerning Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus vanish after their childhood. They likely died young or lived obscure lives, stripped of any political relevance. Cleopatra Selene, however, would go on to marry Juba II, a North African client king of Rome. Through this union, Cleopatra's bloodline continued, not in Egypt, but in the provincial courts of Roman Africa. With Cleopatra's death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. The line had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, since the time of Alexander the Great. Now it was extinguished. In the weeks following the conquest, Octavian formally annexed Egypt as a province of the Roman Empire. It was placed under the direct control of the emperor, not the Senate, a special status that reflected both its wealth and its strategic importance. Egypt would now supply grain, gold, and taxes to Rome, but it would never again govern itself. No native dynasty would rise again. No pharaoh would sit on the throne. The religious rituals would continue, temples would remain active, and the Nile would still flood as it always had. But Egypt's fate was no longer its own. It had become part of an empire. Chapter 7. In the years after her death, Cleopatra's image did not fade. It evolved. It was reshaped, reinterpreted, and repurposed by those who survived her. More than any other figure of her era, she became a symbol, and in many ways a mirror reflecting the anxieties, ambitions, and prejudices of those who wrote about her. The first narratives about Cleopatra came from Roman sources, historians, poets, and political commentators who had every reason to discredit her memory. Chief among them were Plutarch, Cassius Dio, and later Suetonius. These men did not know her personally. They wrote decades, sometimes centuries after her death. Their accounts were shaped by the politics of empire and the triumph of Octavian, who would become Augustus, Rome's first emperor. To them, and to the Roman public, Cleopatra was not simply an Egyptian queen. She was a foreigner, a woman, and a rival to Roman virtue. She was framed as the ultimate seductress, dangerous, manipulative, and corrupting. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not described as alliances between sovereigns, but as acts of seduction. She was blamed for the downfall of Antony. She was portrayed as the reason Roman civil war had erupted once again. In short, she was cast as the threat, while Rome positioned itself as the savior of order. This image endured. In later centuries, Cleopatra was increasingly romanticized. Renaissance artists, Enlightenment thinkers, and 19th century dramatists reimagined her in operas, paintings, and plays. In these portrayals, she was often reduced to two extremes: the tragic lover or the exotic temptress. Her intellect, her governance, and her political strategy were minimized or ignored altogether. By the 20th century, popular culture had fully embraced this dual caricature. Cleopatra became a cinematic icon, her story retold in grand historical dramas, often more concerned with costume and romance than with fact. But the historical Cleopatra was far more complex. She was born into a declining kingdom and assumed power during a time of deep instability. She was one of the few Ptolemies to speak the Egyptian language, a symbolic and practical gesture that linked her more closely to the people she ruled. In addition to Greek and Egyptian, ancient sources suggest she was fluent in multiple languages, including Hebrew, Aramaic, and Latin. She was educated in mathematics, astronomy, rhetoric, and philosophy. She was well versed in the politics of her time and understood the regional dynamics of power across the Eastern Mediterranean. Her reign required not only intelligence but adaptability. She faced the growing influence of Rome, the volatility of her own court, and the long decline of her dynasty. She responded with what she had: diplomacy, alliances, and, when necessary, warfare. She did not succeed in preserving Egypt's independence. She did not live to see her children rise to power, but what she did accomplish was significant. She maintained Egypt's autonomy for 2 decades longer than many believed possible. She kept Roman ambitions at bay through shrewd alliances and personal risk. She shaped the course of Roman politics by sheer force of presence. Few foreign rulers had that kind of influence on the Republic's final decades. Her downfall was not due to incompetence or indulgence. It was the result of historical momentum, of a small kingdom colliding with a rising empire that could not be stopped. In the end, Cleopatra's death marked more than the end of her reign. It marked the end of the Hellenistic world, the final chapter in a history that began with Alexander the Great. She was the last pharaoh, the final monarch of a 3,000-year tradition. Her story, distorted though it often is, remains a reminder of how power is exercised, how history is written, and how memory is shaped, not only by what happened, but by who gets to tell the story. Cleopatra VII was the final chapter in a long and complex history. one that began with Alexander's conquest and ended with Roman domination. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, not a legend, not a myth, but a ruler navigating the hard realities of her time. And though the Nile still flows and the desert winds still move across the ruins of ancient Alexandria, the line of pharaohs ended with her, Cleopatra.